And we're live. Hello, everyone. I'm Sourabhi Dutta Roy, and I welcome you all to the Stories of Beliefs and Social Customs, curated under TMYS Review June 2022 in collaboration with the Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. We are also calling for submissions of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and project architecture, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. It's an absolute honor to be in the company of our esteemed panelists this evening, Professor Edgar, Professor Elizabeth Pike, and Mr. Vineet Malhotra, who will shortly share their valuable views and insights with us. Our topic for today is Pandemic Within a Pandemic, Effects of COVID-19 on Sports, under the sub-theme Sports and Recreation. But before we move on to the discussion, I would now like to take a brief moment to introduce each of our panelists. Professor Edgar holds honorary positions at both Swansea and Cardiff universities in the UK. He's the editor of the journal Sports, Ethics and Philosophy. He has published widely on German philosophy and the philosophy of sport, including 2 books on Yoga and Habermas, namely The Philosophy of Habermas and Habermas' Key Concepts, and a monograph on the aesthetics of sport. We welcome you, sir.
Hello.
Next, we have with us Professor Elizabeth Pike, who is a professor of sport, health, and exercise at the University of Hertfordshire. Her research focuses on the potential of sport and physical activity to address issues of equality and diversity, with particular attention to improving opportunities for females and older adults in and through sport. She has published more than 50 research papers and books and has delivered invited keynote presentations at international conferences on 6 continents. She is co-founder of the Anita White Foundation and past president of the International Sociology of Sport Association. We welcome you, ma'am.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Mr. Vineet Malhotra is a senior journalist with over 2 decades of experience in the mainstream media. He started out with sport, hosting the first season of the IPL, the Commonwealth Games, the Olympics, and the ICC World Cup 2011, 2015, and 2019. He later went to work in Times Now, Zee News, and Tiranga TV as the executive editor. Currently, he is the consulting editor and primetime debate show host for NewsX. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Right. We open the forum for discussion now. I would like to invite Professor Edgar to take it over from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. What I'm going to talk about is, if you like, the political philosophy which lies behind a lot of the regulations which affected sport during the pandemic, but also the tensions within the moral culture of sport, which I think reflect tensions in a wider society. So, I think that a lot of the regulations introduced for the pandemic generally, but also for sport, whether they realised it or not, inspired by the liberal philosophy of John Stuart Mill. Mill was one of the great 19th century British philosophers. And in his articulation of liberalism, he stresses the importance of human freedom, but stresses also that you are free only until your freedom impinges upon the freedom of someone else. So if, for example, my free speech starts putting your life in danger, then my freedom stops. Now, in a way, in the case of the pandemic, if I have the potential to be infectious, then potentially, if you caught the disease from me, then your health would be affected. Potentially, your life itself could be put in danger. And that illness and obviously death is going to stop your freedom. It's going to inhibit your freedom. So lots of the policies which were introduced basically said the sorts of socialization that we should carry out on an everyday level, going out, going to the shops, going to sports matches, had to be either restricted or stopped, because by exercising that freedom, I was potentially endangering the freedoms, undermining the freedoms of other people. So because of that, we found early on in the pandemic, one of the first things that politicians did was basically ban sports matches. lots of sports simply stopped happening. In Britain, for example, the football leagues, the rugby leagues were suspended. When they did come back, often they came back with no crowds. So they came back simply as elite television events. The footballers themselves were allowed to socialise with each other. They could play on the pitch, but no one could watch them, because the idea was that going into the stadium, mixing with lots of other people, you were potentially infecting them. Your freedom to watch a football match would therefore damage other people's freedom to go about their lives, to indeed to continue their life. Also, we found that things like gymnasia, swimming pools, fitness centres were closed. Again, you couldn't socialise in that way. But another element of this, which it's worth stressing, was at the same time that the government, or our Western governments, tended to close down formal sporting events, they were also encouraging people to take exercise. So often at the height of the lockdown, when we were not allowed to go to the shops and we couldn't meet friends, we were still allowed to go out for exercise. And I myself went out nearly every day for a run during that period. Notice there's a bit of a tension here. Exercise is good for you. Apart from anything else, it will build up your immune system, make you stronger to resist COVID. But fitness centres were closed. So we're getting kind of mixed messages here. Also, encouraging people to take exercise turned out to be not very effective, simply because a lot of statistics, again for the Western countries, showed that average weight of the population went up. People put on weight during the pandemic because they didn't exercise. Now, I put that as one side. That, if you like, is the official view. We've got to restrict your freedom in order to protect other greater freedoms. But one or two sports events did go ahead very early when people were beginning to become aware of the pandemic. A classic example was in 2020 in the UK, in early March, the Cheltenham Race Festival went ahead. This is one of our classic race festivals in Britain. Big crowds gathered together. And the organisers were often condemned, for example, in the press, in the newspapers and television and so on, for allowing the Cheltenham races to go ahead. Because, again, they knew that a lot of the people going to that race event could be infected with COVID. Indeed, there was a spike in COVID cases. But now have a think about the people who go to a racing event. They go there to gamble. The whole point of racing is to risk losing money. You like the excitement of risk. Now, in a way, the liberal John Stuart Mill-inspired policies, which the government was pushing, were very much about risk avoidance. Don't go out in case you risk giving the disease to someone else. But the people who went to the race course embrace risk. They're gamblers. It's often seen as a tension in liberal philosophy. Are liberals actually too cautious? They fail to realise that often human beings like taking risks. Let's push this a bit further. In a lot of countries, especially America, college sports activities were curtailed, stopped, and high school and school sports activities were stopped. Again, the argument there was the good liberal one that what we're doing is suspending these activities for the good of the students. We don't want them to risk getting infected themselves. We don't want them to risk spreading a disease, possibly to spectators, possibly to their families and so on. But again, young athletes enjoy taking risk. Just to play sport is a high-risk activity. For example, if you take up the sport of American football, if you have a long career in American football, if you're successful at it, the likelihood is you will retire with serious bone injuries to your hips and your knees. It's almost guaranteed. So if you take up a sport like American football, you could say the same for rugby, to a degree also for many other sports like soccer, even cricket, you are risking injury. You know that. Now, in some ways, young people are not terribly good at assessing risk. They have a much more short-term view of these things than maybe older people. So that liberal Millsian view also got a strong bit of paternalism. There were older people, the regulators of the games, saying, we know better, we know you should not be allowed to take the risks. But that also had an impact. It inhibited these young players pursuing their careers. It stopped them just enjoying the sports they wanted to do. So we've got this sort of tension, I think, in culture. And the tension on one side, in the sense, the cautious, risk-averse liberal policy, on the other side, the athlete, possibly also the gambler. Anything but risk-averse. Their sport is a risk, their gambles are risks. One of the great philosophers of sport, Roger Kawa, argued that there are games which he described as having an element of vertigo about them. And in part, he meant sort of physical vertigo. So we enjoy activities like roller coasters and things like this, playful events, which we think health or life is being threatened. So no, it's not really. But Kawa does then get to a core of an element of sport. Sport is a high-risk activity. It has got that vertiginous element. It is about vertigo. It's about as if you can imagine the high diver standing on the top board, about to jump into the water. There's some literal vertigo about that. And as you go onto the sports pitch, at the very least, you're risking losing, even if you're not risking your life. So maybe one of the things that sport was doing throughout COVID and throughout the pandemic was highlighting that other side of our cultures, the risk takers, the ones that recognize that maybe life is short, you enjoy it to the maximum. And so, to some degree, I think sport actually was in tension with the much more official policy regulations, which were restricting our lives, telling us to be cautious, telling us to be sensible. Sport was that disruptive voice saying, I don't want to be sensible. I want to take risks. I'll stop there. Those are a few ideas. I think we'll have some questions later, and I'll perhaps say some more then. But thank you for listening, and I hope that made some sense and said something to you. Thank you.
Right, that was wonderful, sir. Thank you very much. Moving on to Professor Pike. Over to you now.
Thank you, and thanks again for inviting me. If I could have the PowerPoint presentation, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So I'd like to focus on the experiences, particularly of women and girls during the pandemic. And I'm going to do this by looking at the work of the International Working Group on Women and Sport. And the IWG, as it's called, described the pandemic as a significant threat to the women in sport and physical activity movement globally. And they put out a global call for action. And the reason they felt that the pandemic had a particular effect on women and girls in sport came under five main areas. So one was the impact on the well-being of women in lockdown. The second one was safety issues, widely documented issues about the safety of women and girls generally in society during the lockdowns that might also lead to lower participation rates. The third was because of the financial impact of the pandemic, there's a view that resource was going to be taken out of women's sport to support men's. And then the other issues were to do with leadership and the structure, that because of the pandemic putting pressure on sport, we might be less creative, rather than more creative and just revert to our old ways, which means male dominance of sport, and also not reimagining the structure. And these are open for question in the way that Andrew has also just flagged. So for those in the audience not familiar with the IWG, this is the world's largest network dedicated to advancing gender equity. It's aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's developed the Brighton Declaration, which became the Brighton plus Helsinki Declaration on Women in Sport, and stages a world conference every 4 years on women in sport. And just recently, it launched an insight hub. So just to take the Brighton Declaration just to start with, this is an international treaty that is about supporting the fair and equitable system of sport that's fully inclusive of women and girls. And the pandemic shone a spotlight on fairness, equity, and inclusivity. And the principles of the declaration are laid out thereabouts: the allocation of facilities and resources, participation through to high performance sport, leadership, and so on. And there's about 600 signatories at the moment. And a quick search of the signatories showed that in India, where I know many of the audience today are from, the National Federation, the Netball Federation and the Softball Association of India are signatories to this declaration. And then in terms of what the IWG does, every 4 years, the Secretariat moves to a new country. And at the end of their quadrennial, they produce a progress report and a legacy. So after the first conference in 1994, the Secretariat moved to Namibia for the conference in 1998, and there was the Windhoek Call for Action. It then moved to Canada, and there was the Montreal Toolkit, then moved to Japan and the Kumamoto Commitment to Collaboration, Australia for the Sydney Scoreboard. And then in 2014, so 20 years after the Brighton Declaration and IWG had been established, there was a review of the Brighton Declaration and it became the Brighton plus Helsinki Declaration. And then the most recent report in Botswana and Gaborone was the Botswana Big Five. In terms of where the IWG is now, the current Secretariat is in New Zealand. And because of the pandemic, the New Zealand Secretariat have been impacted significantly in terms of what they could do, which included their conference that should have been taking place in May and has now been postponed to November, where it will be held as a hybrid conference in Auckland. And that's interesting in itself in terms of how an international association has had to respond to the pandemic in terms of the way it's organised itself and structured. And the New Zealand Secretariat should be credited for how they've responded really proactively to this. And they've also managed to establish this new Insight Hub. So in terms of the most recent progress report, bearing in mind this was published before the pandemic, what was described as the most urgent inequality that women and girls encounter in physical activity and sport were being underrepresented in decision-making positions, underrepresented as coaches and instructors, and being more vulnerable than men to gender-based violence, including sexual harassment and abuse. So this was pre-pandemic, but these issues have been exacerbated during the pandemic as well. Before I go on to the pandemic, just to say, to identify, there are also issues in this movement that are currently underreported, and I think it's really worth flagging these. One of them is, this is the International Working Group on Women and Sport, and there are other international groups for women and sport. And of course, this reflects a gender binary that could be problematic to those who identify as non-binary, trans, or intersex. Sport also tends to focus on younger people. Andrew was just talking about younger people tending to take risks and so on. And yet actually, the fastest growing population in the world, including in India, are older people. And we know that by the middle of this century, a fifth of the world's population is going to be aged over 60, and the majority of these will define as women. And the third, and I think this is really current at the moment, is people on the move, particularly given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's put into the spotlight forced migration. And we know with the Ukraine situation, the majority of the refugees are women and children. And this also has an impact in terms of what's happening in sports. So this exacerbates what's happened during the pandemic as well. So there's three groups that I think we really need to be thinking about how they were affected during the pandemic and what happens coming out of the pandemic. So in terms of the effects of the pandemic on women's sport, the United Nations, along with the IWG, have had this global call for action. The United Nations UN Women now has a Sports for Generation Equality movement, and they've identified their 5 main key challenges and priorities coming out of the pandemic. And they relate to the recent progress reports as well. So women's leadership, gender-based violence, the economic impacts on women in sport, women's representation in the media, and the fact that a lot of girls returned to very traditional roles during lockdown when they couldn't leave the house, and that included not participating in sports. And these are issues that now need to be addressed as we think about what happens as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic fully. In terms of India, we know that in comparison to their male counterparts, there's been a relatively slow return for women's football, cricket, kabaddi, and tennis in particular. So there are particular struggles there. And then in terms of what happens as women in sport emerge from the pandemic, the incoming IWG Secretariat is going to the United Kingdom. Sorry, I've got an echo. I don't know if that's on somebody's microphone. And so the UK will be hosting the next secretariat for the IWG. At the same time, there's a new global observatory that's been set up for gender equality. And again, what might be interesting to many of this audience is that the chief executive of the global observatory is Payoshni Mitra, who is an Indian athletes' rights advocate and activist. And Payoshni, I will be the research lead for the IWG from later on this year. And Payoshni and I have already met. We met last month and are in regular contact about how we can work more closely together to actually advance the agenda for women and girls in sport as we emerge from the pandemic. So the IWG Secretariat, this is the mission and vision. I'm very happy for these slides to be shared or for people to contact me. And the vision is for there to be a just and sustainable post-pandemic world where women and girls play a full and equitable part at every level of sport. And this was our focus, even going into the main part of the pandemic as we were writing the bid. And we're doing this by focusing on having an international sensibility, a sustainable sports system, and inclusivity. And then just to finish, in terms of relationships with India, I can't recommend highly enough the wonderful book edited by outstanding scholars Meena Gopal and Padma Prakash that was recently published on sports studies in India. I had the very great privilege of contributing a chapter to this book, looking at the ways that we can theorize sport, particularly as we emerge from the pandemic. And so thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this and to shine a particular spotlight on the experiences of women and girls.
Right, that was a wonderful presentation, ma'am. And thank you very much. Moving on to Mr. Malhotra. Over to you, sir.
Okay, well, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Very interesting points which have been made, not only related to COVID-19, but other anomalies that exist in sports as well, and how this gulf has only increased since COVID-19 came about. I'm going to focus on I'm not going to speak for more than 5 minutes. I'm going to predominantly focus on how India has been affected by COVID-19. I think the entire sports industry has changed. At what point we thought this to be unthinkable, it's already come and passed. A lot of sports were hit, even cricket was hit, but there were some sports that were completely annihilated as a result of this particular pandemic. If you look at hockey, hockey events were the fewest in the last couple of years. All of these sports and these sports bodies, they make money through licensing of television broadcast rights, and for a lot of them, this was a very unfair deal, and they got the raw end and the short end of the stick. And the stoppage in sporting activities is something that has hit, the financial pockets of all these bodies, including the BCCI, which is the richest cricket body in the world. But India somehow survived because cricket in India is considered to be the only sport that makes money. But countries like West Indies, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, they face so many challenges that you can't even fathom. The richest cricketers in some of these smaller nations were actually, looking out for other work because they did not find cricket to be a sustainable model of growth for them or for their families. We saw what happened with the IPL as well. We saw what happened with South Africa. The series was abandoned. The IPL was washed out. But there was time for everybody to introspect as to what could be changed in cricket, what could be brought about. We tried the bio bubbles as well. And the big three revenue sharing countries, which is India, England, and Australia, went back to the drawing board and they came up with this bio bubble. It worked to some extent, but it still affected the players. It might have not affected the itinerary, but the players who come out and play and make physical contact, knowing that there is a new variant out, would definitely affect it. The biggest example of all of that is Virat Kohli. He hasn't scored a century in the last couple of years, and in cricket, there is a yo-yo test, there's a fitness test, and a lot of the players who used to pass these tests easily a couple of years ago uh, struggle today to get through it because like some of the previous speakers also said, that the entire fitness uh, regimen and the consolidated fitness of teams together has gone down. So it was a battle for survivor, and for weaker nations, it was very hard to sustain because of no cash flow. They could not meet their expenditures, and there were some casualties as well. Casualties in the sense that they had to let go of a lot of assets at times. I can speak that for the Zimbabwe Cricket Board. Uh, so it's been a tough couple of years, and cricket is lucky, in fact. If you look at how our Olympians struggled in the last couple of years, because peaking is very important in sport. They missed out on all that peaking, and they missed out on rubbing shoulders with the best from around the world for a long time. Neeraj Chopra did give us that gold medal, but I definitely feel if these couple of years were not wasted, then India would have done fantastically well in the last Olympics, which was held in Tokyo. So out and out, it's been a mixed bag. There's been a lot of ambivalence when it comes to sports in India. Uh, the IPL used to contribute to around 1100 crore rupees to the Indian GDP, and this is something which was given by the BCCI, and that figure plummeted, to less than half for 2020 and 2021. A lot of leagues, including the Indian Super League, which was a massive hit at the beginning, saw empty stadiums in Goa. The I League also started and it went off because of the pandemic. A lot of world qualifiers that India was supposed to be a part of, they did not happen against Qatar, Afghanistan, Bangladesh. Uh, those were some, fixtures that India could have easily won. You look at badminton, just came to a screeching halt. Nothing happened there. You look at tennis also, the low-ranked players, they were completely ostracized and eliminated. So out and out, India has been at the receiving end of this. But the point is, how do we bounce back now? How do we recuperate from this massive loss that we have, incurred? I think Indian sport is basically galvanized by cricket, and if cricket can resume in its entirety, if cricket can resume in its usual elan, then I think the other sports will also be motivated to follow suit. Uh, but since the last Olympics, there were a number of areas where India was slated to do well. It was athletics, it was archery, it was boxing. There were a number of leagues that started out. International players started to come in. Indians started to participate in international events. All of that stopped, even in wrestling. And so everybody needs to get their brains together, their heads together, and figure out, how sport will return. I think we will have to live with the threat of coronavirus. Smaller sporting leagues will die. Big sporting leagues, will endure. The IPL will be there, just like the NBA survived. EPL survives whenever there is something of this sort. But smaller clubs and smaller teams and smaller associations will definitely die. What should happen when something like this unfolds? Well, the government is always looked upon. The government has to chart out a roadmap. If you want to return to normalcy, you have to act normal. And social distancing will definitely be a big hurdle in acting normal. But if the government can maintain social distancing in stadiums, social distancing in other areas, where group activity is involved, I think then sports can return to its normalcy. Thank you.
Right, that was really wonderful and crisp, sir. Thank you very much. Moving on to the short Q&A. My first question is for Professor Edgar. So with time, within the 2 years, we have adjusted to the new normal, as Mr. Malhotra just stated, like the bio bubble of cricket. But do you think these temporary solutions have taken away the recreation out of sports? And do you think that it has affected the sports personas who have played for an empty stadium?
That's a really interesting question. This whole idea of the new normal to begin with, I think is fascinating. As Elizabeth was saying, we've got this sort of aspiration to have a juster and more sustainable post-pandemic world. In my bleaker moments, I worry that our new normal will be the old one once again. But as you say, that there is more regulation now, and I suppose in a way that does threaten the playful elements of sport. But I think it's worth remembering, especially for professional sports, they are already highly regulated. And in some ways, the COVID regulations that Vineet was talking about, the social distancing, the bubbles and so on, are just added to a whole raft of regulations which professional players have to deal with. The drug testing one to be a classic one. So I suspect in professional sport it won't make a big difference because, yes, they are professionals. But I think it's a very telling question about the persona of the player. There was a lot of concern in the UK when football came back, really as just a television event, whether that would actually change the dynamics of the game, because the crowd at a football match makes a big difference. And it has an impact not just on players, but also referees. Referees often take their cues as to whether a foul has been committed from the reaction of the crowd. It's going to be a predominantly home crowd. So teams are losing that advantage. So yeah, I think the persona of the player does change when they see themselves, if you like, as a television personality, rather than as a live figure before their crowd, interacting with their crowd. And it would be interesting to see how that develops, whether the new normal is actually thinking of sport even more as a television event played by professionals, rather than a physical event played by amateurs. I hope that's a sort of an answer, but a really interesting question to reflect on. Thank you.
Right. Moving on to my next question is for Professor Pike. Ma'am, you have done some research on the contribution of physical activity to social connectivity in adults living with dementia. What effect do you think the pandemic has had on people or groups with dementia? And do you have any tips regarding the social well-being of such people through sports and recreation?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking me that and for giving me the opportunity to talk about another area of my work. So I mentioned in my presentation about the importance of looking at different populations, and I've worked for a long time with older adults and more recently with people living with dementia who are often older as well, such is the nature of it. And during the pandemic, dementia was the most common pre-existing condition in deaths involving COVID-19. So people living with dementia were particularly affected by the pandemic. And surveys that were done found that about half of the people living with dementia reported that the lockdown had had a negative impact on their mental health. And in particular, it was to do with being socially isolated and lonely. So whereas physical activity pre the pandemic had enabled people living with dementia to connect with other people, the lockdown stopped that. But I think it's also important to say it's not only the people who are living with dementia themselves, it's the people who are affected by dementia as carers or family members. They spent in the UK more than 90 million extra hours caring for their loved ones who were living with dementia. So, of course, that then had an impact on the carers and family. So they said that the pandemic had a negative impact on their mental and physical health, partly because they couldn't get out and do physical activity, not only because of the lockdowns, but because they had these extra care responsibilities. So the pandemic had a really significant impact. And then to go on to your second question about the sort of tips, there's very early evidence that physical activity might reduce the risk of developing dementia. We're early in understanding that. We do know that physical activity and sport can provide the social connectivity, and it can address loneliness for people living with dementia who are often isolated. And I think in terms of tips, it's thinking about, do we take physical activity into people's homes, or do we bring people living with dementia into the community? And obviously, the more it's possible to do the latter and adapt facilities and so on, that's great for connecting people with the community. But if not, it's about taking physical activity into people's homes and enabling them to get the benefits of the activity and the connections that way. So thank you. That was, I really appreciate being given the opportunity to talk about that as well.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. I think Mr. Malhotra is having some network issues, so I'll move on to Professor Edgar again. So how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the youth or student athletes' experiences with physical activity, mental health, and social connections?
I think it's had an enormous impact. As I think all three of us have been stressing how important sport, physical activity is to both our physical and our mental health. And being denied that, or instead of being pushed back on our own resources to carry on exercising. So you could go out on your solitary exercise, but you couldn't go to the gym, you couldn't go to your sports club. You couldn't just go out for the socialization of watching a match. I think that was bad. As he said, and it maybe impacts certain groups more than others, and youth is certainly one group which was impacted. For example, in the UK and lots of other countries, schools were of course suspended. And if schools are suspended, so too is the sports classes you take at school. So again, I think there is evidence, I'm sure Elizabeth has these statistics much more to her fingers than I do, that school children have been putting on weight during the pandemic. Again, that lack of exercise. It's also, and I think Vineet hinted at this when he was talking about the Olympics, it's also impacted those potentially professional athletes because they were losing the opportunity to prove their skills. You see this most acutely in the United States, where there's a very regulated system which progresses you from being a good high school athlete to a college athlete to a professional athlete. And basically you will have a season to prove yourself before you're recruited into the higher level. And of course, for a lot of athletes, that season was the 2021 season, which they lost. And so part of the pressure to bring back college sports in America was to give those athletes their chance to prove themselves. So I expect a lot of young athletes have lost out on the training, the competitions where they would have proved their ability, and that has badly affected their careers. In some ways, again, you can see sport here mirroring the wider problem. Lots of actors and theatre performers faced exactly the same problem. Theatres are closed, you can't prove yourself, you can't progress your career. And so, yeah, I think there's been a whole raft of impacts on people's development, an idea of who they are, where they're going, hence also their mental and also physical health. So again, a really interesting question, thank you.
Right. Moving on to Professor Pike. Ma'am, in your publication, Sports in Society, you have talked about conflict theory and Karl Marx. Sports are the tools of the wealthy. Do you agree to this notion? And with regard to this context, how do you think the sports economy has been affected during the pandemic?
Yes, thank you, and also thanks for mentioning the book, and also I picked this up in the book that I mentioned at the end of the presentation, specifically in relation to sport in India. In terms of the conflict theory and Karl Marx and sport being a tool of the wealthy, we know sport can reproduce social inequalities. There's no doubt about that. And Vineet, identified the impact on some sports during the pandemic, particularly because of the loss of the broadcasting rights. He talked about cricket and hockey and so on. But I think it's important to say inequalities aren't only about wealth and finance. There's other forms of inequality, and not all sport is dependent on significant amounts of money. Obviously some is, but not all of it is. So in terms of whether I agree with the notion, the approach that I've taken in most of my work is I use what's called an interactionist approach, a critical interactionist approach, where I'm more concerned about understanding the lived experience of sport, and in this case during the pandemic, and not only the financial structure, not ignoring the fact that where resources invested is obviously extremely important in terms of the future of sport. And I think also, to kind of put a positive spin on it, sport can promote equality, and sport can address power gaps. So sport isn't inherently good or bad. It's what we do with sport that defines how sport's used and what benefits or otherwise it has. I think in terms of the pandemic, sport obviously relies on human contact. And Andrew started with the fantastic description about restrictions on freedom. And of course, sports, as Andrew mentioned right at the very beginning of this session, was one of the things to be hit first, and it affected participation, and actually it affected fandom. So although people could watch sports via TV in some cases, people couldn't go to live games and so on. But I think, just to sort of come back to where I was talking about earlier, there was a disproportionate effect on women's sports. And I think that, just to raise that again. But I also think there's opportunities to rethink sport now, to challenge this status quo, to challenge sport being a tool of the wealthy, as Marx may have said, and to kind of reinvent. Andrew said sport was a disruptive voice during the pandemic. Let's make the most of that. Having a disruptive voice is really important if we're going to make positive change. So I love that notion that Andrew introduced about sport as a disruptive voice, and let's turn that to our benefit to rethink sport going forward.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Malhotra, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm
Sir?
sorry. My internet crashed. I'm sorry, I got logged out.
I think he's still having some network issues. Moving on to Professor Edgar. So how do you think the pandemic has affected team sports? And do you agree that it has in turn affected the traditions and culture of a community?
Again, very interesting question. Team sports. I think one of the things that follows on from very much what Elizabeth was just saying about the power structures in sport. But I think it's worth remembering that at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic was raging, we got the reassertion of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that focused on, especially again using the American example, was the differential between black and white players in the professional American leagues and the risks which were being placed disproportionately upon them. So I think one of the things that maybe the pandemic has done, I hope, is highlight the different ways in which individual players are treated within the team and highlighted to degree the inequalities. Whether things like bubbles have increased the sense of integration of teams, I don't know. Do we now look more for teams than we look to individual stars? I think probably it varies from sport to sport. But certainly there's potential there for teams as a whole to be more aware of what is being expected from them, to challenge whether that is fair, whether burdens are distributed evenly. As to the question of culture and tradition, that's really fascinating because I think all sports tell their histories, develop sometimes their own mythologies. There are great moments in all sports where the heroes stood out or where disasters happened. So I suspect in many ways, when the pandemic is looked back upon, these few years and seasons, so the 2021 season, the 2022 season, and so on, will be seen as special events that maybe do reshape how individual sports have seen themselves, recognize the threats, hopefully make those sports more inclusive. So recognizing the place of women's sports, as Vineet was saying, recognizing those sports which get lesser television coverage, but are still very important. And maybe, yeah, that the important thing about COVID-19 is it will rewrite the history of sports, whether it's the individual sport or sport as a whole, and challenge some of our preconceptions, some of our ideas, some of our prejudices about how sport should have been played. Maybe that will bring that new, more sustainable and juster post-COVID future. I hope so.
Right. Moving on to Mr. Malhotra. Sir, what should we do to promote sports and recreation and physical fitness, keeping in mind the pandemic setting?
Well, that's a good question. I think the pandemic, what it has done predominantly is people have lost the confidence of being infectious free. So the hygiene related to the pandemic has to be brought back in. Uh, by hygiene, I mean not only in terms of social distancing and cleanliness. By hygiene, I mean protocols surrounding crowds, protocols surrounding players, protocols of being inoculated in time, protocols related to people observing the rules that the government mandates that are essential to be followed, is something which is going to be very, very imperative if you want the confidence in people to come back. Just wearing masks, putting on sanitizers, and knowing what's going on is not going to be much of a difference, because what has happened in the last couple of years that people have started consuming so much information online uh, that they have forgotten how to distinguish between the right and the wrong one. So when it comes to sportsmen, when it comes to people who want to follow sports, go to stadiums, I think there has to be some sort of an authority created, maybe some sort of a committee that is going to take a call on what's supposed to be done, how many people should be allowed in stadiums, how many matches the Indian team can play in a year if the virus continues the way it has continued for the last couple of years. I think if that is done, confidence in terms of recreation and recreational sports is definitely going to get a booster shot.
Right. Okay. My next question to you, sir. How has COVID-19 helped shape, in whatever negative or positive way, identity as a concept and identity of individuals as well as of groups?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question?
How has COVID-19 helped shape, in whatever negative or positive way, identity as a concept and identity of individuals as well as of groups?
Are you sure that's a sporting question? Okay. All right. What COVID has done, I'm going to answer in terms of the sports perspective. What COVID has done is made sports a lot more dear. Uh, I think we value sports a lot more than we did before the pandemic. Because, like they say, forbidden fruit is always tempting. So the lesser you have of something, the more you value it. As a group, I think individuals have started to maintain boundaries, have started to respect, uh, health in others and health in themselves. Although fitness levels have gone down, but the idea of nutrition has really, really taken center stage at this point in time. I speak to a lot of cricketing friends from time to time. I speak to a lot of people whose job it is to just be fit. They wake up in the morning, all they think of is how to get fitter than they were a day before. Uh, Maybe it was not something that they took care of before COVID. Some of these people are naturally gifted. They have natural stamina. They have natural talent. You would never see a Rohit Sharma or a Sachin Tendulkar work out as much as a Virat Kohli or a Hardik Pandya because they were basically compensating for uh, a lack of something. But Sachin and Rohit had that naturally. So I think that has really changed the way players approach the game today. Nutrition and exercise is equally important, uh, and I think that's going to be a defining factor as long as it continues to be a priority for sports persons because they would have that in the back of their mind that the pandemic can return any day. So our health and our fitness as a group and as an individual, individuals make a group. So as a group and as an individual needs to be a full-time job.
Right. My next question is for Professor Pike. Ma'am, you have already talked about COVID-19 affecting the women athletes, but I'd still like to know how it has affected them more physically or on a mental level. If you could talk some more about it.
Yeah, thank you. I think really this is, I guess, just to reiterate that the pandemic really exposed social fragility and inequalities and the kind of fault lines in societies. Who was privileged, who wasn't privileged. It was interesting hearing Andrew talk earlier on about we're only free until freedom imposes on somebody else. And it was sort of the same during the pandemic about privilege, that we'll give things to other people as long as it doesn't impact on our own privileges. And so what happens during the pandemic is that some groups lost out because there were limits in terms of who could do sport, who was going to have the TV coverage, who was going to have access to facilities and so on. And that really impacted heavily on women as well as other social groups as well. So I think the pandemic just exposed those fault lines in society. But the upside of that is that it's shone a spotlight on it in a way that perhaps people didn't realize, in the way that Vineet just said. It wasn't until we saw, we realized what we were missing that we really wanted it. And it wasn't until the pandemic that some people were really aware of those fault lines and those disadvantages. And so I think this is absolutely a moment in time to reinvent sport for gender equality and for other forms of equality as well, and use that disruptive influence that Andrew was talking about earlier.
Okay. My last question is for Mr. Malhotra. Sir, what effect did the ongoing pandemic have on the psychology or mindset of the athletes as well as the spectators or sport enthusiasts? Your take on
Oh,
that.
tremendous. It was a travesty. Uh, what happened to athletes and the way they approach the game. Like I said, I spoke of Virat Kohli and how he hasn't scored a century, 100 runs in the last couple of years. That's a big deal. If I'm a cricketer and if I'm used to striking a century every second game, imagine not having to score 100 in the last 2 years. And that is obviously has nothing to do, with a shift in his psychology or his approach to the game. It has something to do with the gap that came in the middle. The consistency. He was denied consistency of games, and that's why we were denied consistency by Virat Kohli. Uh, I think there's been a lot of frustration in athletes. I speak to friends who are sportsmen. Uh, you know, if, for every athlete, every sports person, the real litmus test is to go out there and perform. You know, it may be a good idea to go to the gym and work out, spar with people, work out in the nets, but the real action is what all athletes wait for, and that did not happen. So, you know, all kinds of emotions crept into their psyche. You know, they went from being depressed, from being, you know, to imagining that they will be broke if this continues, people will let go of them. So, you know, there was this entire cycle that went through all of these athletes. Maybe not the top rung because they had already been comfortable. But see, after a point, money is not important to these athletes. What's important is, you know, scoring runs, performing better, beating other teams. You know, Michael Jordan did not have to come back in '96 and win the fourth championship, or in '95 or in '96. He had all the money he could make. He had billions of dollars. Everyone in the world knew him. He only did it for satisfaction. You know, he wanted to go back home and imagine himself as to be the best athlete in the world. So imagine if Michael Jordan was denied that, if COVID came at that point in time, you know, Michael Jordan would not have the legacy that he has today. Maybe LeBron James, another basketball legend, has missed out on that because for a couple of years, we saw him also, you know, not competing at the level that he was used to. So this is just a microcosm of what went through, you know, with the best. Just imagine the people who were still trying to, you know, climb the ladder of success. Just imagine, you know, those smaller clubs, those smaller players, people who had just entered the system or were drafted into teams. Just imagine what they must have gone through. You know, their entire life was in front of them, and it was just washed away because of the pandemic. So I think there was a lot of uh, reconciliation that went in their heads, and you know, they somehow managed to survive these years, and they're hoping that the pandemic will go, and you know, they'll be back into the grind. But it's been terrible what athletes have gone through. Um, some have benefited also. You know, like some certain industries made millions of dollars when the pandemic came. But there were some athletes similar to that, you know, who got a lot of time to do what they do. You know, shooters who have shooting ranges at home, they were at home and they were practicing at home. They got better at it. But for a cricketer, for a badminton player, or for a tennis player, you have to go out there and practice as well. They couldn't do that. You know, I mean, every tennis player will not have a tennis court in his backyard. You know, so just imagine the access that was denied to them must have brutalized their psyche. But on a positive note, I think there's been a spring up. People are bouncing back, and you know, we just have to live with COVID. We just have to embrace sports. We have to embrace the disease. We have to embrace risks. You know, if we want sports to survive.
Right, thank you, sir. With that, we come to an end. It was an absolute delight to get to know such thought provoking insights today. I'm sure our viewers who watch the live and who will be watching it on our Facebook page will love it equally. Thank you once again to Professor Edgar, Professor Pike, and Mr. Malhotra for taking out time from your busy schedules to speak on the TMYS platform. It was absolutely enriching. Just a reminder, we are calling for submission of essays, poems, and short stories related to the project. To know more about our submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Thank you all.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. See you, Elizabeth.